Okay, so this starts our flipped classroom on chapter 18, excuse me, or the reign of King Cotton. All right, post-war changes to Texas farming. You have to remember that after the Civil War, the entire southern economy was crippled. In the South, many people had their savings in things that were called bonds. A bond is a certificate that's issued by the government promising to pay back a borrowed sum plus interest. So for example, you might actually own bonds because it's pretty popular that when a baby's born, people will buy that baby bonds. And let's say that your grandpa bought you a $50 bond when you were born. Well, a lot of times the rate of interest on that is that the bond will mature when you turn, let's say 20 or 18, and then that bond will be worth $100 instead of $50. So that's what these bonds were. Plus, many businesses had sold goods to the Confederate government on credit, and the money was never repaid. So as you can imagine, if you have purchased a bond from the Confederate government, is that bond going to be any good? Of course not, because now the Confederacy has fallen, the Confederacy no longer exists, there is no Confederate government, so there is no money to repay that bond. So, the economy across the South was crippled. Post-war changes. There was a lack of transportation beyond the wagon. The railroad had not yet entered Texas on any scale at all. There were a few lines that ran partially into Texas, but there was really no railroad. So beyond horse-drawn carriage or horseback, there was really a lack of transportation. This resulted in subsistence farming because it was so difficult to get goods from place to place, or for you to get from place to place. Families would produce just enough goods that they needed to live, with just a tiny little bit extra for sale. So again, subsistence farming, producing all the goods that you need as a family. So you're growing everything the family needs, and then you may have just a little bit to sell or trade. There was a definite move away from commercial farming. Remember, commercial farming in the South was pretty big prior to the Civil War, because what type of labor was there prior to the Civil War? That's right, there was slave labor. Well, when slavery ended, the commercial farming basically collapsed because there was no one to work on the same level that the slaves had worked. And then, of course, I already said that anything extra was bartered for needed items. All right, another type of farming that came into being at this point is called tenant farming. It became very, very popular. Plantation owners had no people and no money to work the land. So what they did is they rented the land out in sections, and these farmers became known as tenant farmers. Now, you're not going to see a lot of freedmen becoming tenant farmers because that would require having money. You would need the money to rent the land. You would have to have your own supplies. And these freedmen did not have any money or supplies. Remember, they're former slaves. But tenant farming was another thing that had changed. The problem with tenant farming, tenants rarely made enough to ever buy the land. Here was the result. Tenant farmers, in the year 1880, there were 38% of them. By 1900, that amount had risen to 50%. Then came the sharecroppers. Okay, sharecroppers are farmers who could not afford to pay rent. They couldn't afford to pay it in cash. So a lot of your freedmen are going to become sharecroppers. What's going to happen here is that the rent's going to be taken out as shares of the crops. Some sharecroppers even had to rent equipment and seeds. Sharecropping was a vicious cycle. You have to borrow money from the landowner to live on the land. You have to borrow money from the landowner to buy seeds. You have to borrow money from the landowner in order to have equipment. And the whole thing is that when your crop comes in, that landowner will then take whatever you owed him out of the top. So do you think that you're ever going to have very much money as a sharecropper? Are you ever going to be able to afford to own your own land? Are you ever going to be able to afford to buy your own seed right out or to own your own equipment? Probably not. Sharecropping was a vicious cycle of poverty. Okay, I want you to stop for a second here, and I want you to look at your activity. It has all of these things defined for you. You're welcome. But what you need to do is you need to pause it here, and it says, about halfway down the first page, says, draw a picture that illustrates the difference between subsistence, commercial, and tenant farming. So you're going to do like 3 separate little pictures here that show me the difference between these 3 types of farming. Do these pictures need to be colored? Yes. So I'm expecting that now you're going to pause this presentation and you're going to draw that picture. Okay, continuing on with the discussion of sharecropper. At the end of the Civil War, it was estimated that Texas had 250,000 freedmen, making up about 30% of the total population. Sharecropping continued to grow and maintain a cycle of poverty for many. Here is the cycle of poverty. You're going to be doing a handout over this, but I want you to look at it right now. It says, you can see here, number 1 here, it says sharecroppers receive land and seed. In exchange, he promises landowner half the crop. Sharecropper buys food and clothing on credit from landowner's store. Sharecropper plants and harvests. Sharecropper gives landowner a crop to sell. Sharecropper gets half the earnings minus his debt for the year. When settling up, landowner says that sharecropper owes more than he has earned. To pay debt, sharecropper promises landowner a greater share of the next year's crop. So you see, this is a cyclical cycle of poverty that this poor sharecropper can never, ever get out of. I want you to look back at your activity, and it says that you need to summarize this cycle in your own words. And the cycle, of course, is the sharecropping cycle of poverty. So summarize that cycle in your own words. You're going to want to pause it. All right. Railroads mean the birth or rebirth of commercial farming. All right, in 1861, there were 100 miles of railroad in Texas. By 1890, there were more than 8,000 miles of railroad. Railroads meant easier and cheaper transportation of goods. Railroad companies bought land on both sides of the track and sold it to farmers. The result was commercial farming. Another result was farming expanded into West Texas. All right, let's talk about commercial farming again. Remember, commercial farming is farming on a huge scale so that you're planting and growing much more than your family could ever consume. The whole reason that you're farming is to sell whatever it is that you're farming to make a profit. So usually you're going to sell something that is a non-food item, cotton, tobacco. Or if you are selling a food item, you're going to grow it in huge amounts. Wheat, corn, much, much more than your family could ever consume. That is commercial farming. Looking at this map, I want you to look back at your paper, and it says, explain where the railroad expanded to and why that area was chosen. So you're going to look at your key here. Red was by 1870, blue was by 1890. You're going to figure out why these areas were chosen. Okay, why these expansion areas were chosen. You know, I also want you, this is just going to be a little side note, if you look down at the very bottom of that page, that second page, you have some room at the bottom. I want you to put an asterisk, and I want you to answer this question. Why were there no railroads right here? Why were there no railroads? Why was there only this railroad here and this railroad here? What could possibly have prevented more railroads in this area? Okay, so I want you to make sure you answer that question. It's going to be worth at least 10 points when I grade your spiral. All right, moving on. A new water source. Okay, so we've talked about this in class. Underground water was discovered and windmills were used to pump the water. Therefore, windmills would become a sign of civilization. Windmills are going to make all the difference in terms of bringing water to cattle, bringing water to crops, irrigation. Windmills are going to change the face of Texas. Between windmills and barbed wire, the frontier would never be the same. Technology. All right, advancements in technology in terms of farming. Okay, of course, we have railroads. Look at this. I think this is really interesting. The cost of shipping a 500-pound bale of cotton from Denison to Houston, by ox cart, it costs $15 and it would take 2 weeks. By train, it cost $4 and would take 1 day. Amazing. The iron plow, another huge invention. It was stronger and it lasted longer. Remember, you know, those old plows, they would break so easily, but these iron plows were much, much stronger, and they became known as the Blue Kellys. Another thing was the cotton gin. Instead of having to separate the cotton from the seed by hand, these gins now could separate these seeds much, much faster. Thus, more cotton could be grown because it could be separated quicker. I mean, it's just a complete cycle. The better your equipment, the more you can grow. Amazing. Okay, causes and effects of cotton. A cause would be commercial farming was time consuming. So what's going to happen? You're spending so much time here, you're going to have to buy more manufactured goods. So that means where you may have had time in the past to make your own candles or sew your own clothes because you're able to weave your own material. You know, you're not going to really have the time for this anymore. Everyone's going to be consumed with this commercial farm. So now you and your family are going to be buying more manufactured items, more things that are ready-made. Manufacturing is going to increase. Therefore, cities are going to grow like Dallas and Houston, which are going to become major manufacturing cities. Okay, cotton is king. Life revolved around cotton. Towns were built to provide farmers with manufactured items. Religious revival meetings and elections were scheduled during the summers when work was slow. Weddings, fairs, and other social activities were after the harvest when people had money. All right, this is the end of our slideshow, but here's a question at the very bottom. It says, what could go wrong? So here's what I want you to consider. If your entire existence is focused on farming, your entire existence is cotton, every penny you make, every penny you spend revolves around cotton. What could possibly go wrong? Okay, so I'm going to assign this today, which is Monday, February the 20th, and then it is going to be due by Friday. See you in class.